Book 1, Chapter 1 of The Cinema Murder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Cinema Murder by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Book 1, Chapter 1. With a somewhat prolonged grinding of the brakes and an unnecessary amount of fuss in the way of letting off steam, the afternoon train from London came to a standstill in the station at Detton Magna. An elderly porter, putting on his coat as he came, issued with the dogged aid of one bound by custom to perform a hopeless mission from the small red-brick lamp-room. The station-master, occupying a position of vantage in front of the shed which enclosed the booking-office, looked up and down the lifeless row of closed and streaming windows with an expectancy dulled by daily disappointment for the passengers who seldom alighted. On this occasion no records were broken. A solitary young man stepped out onto the wet and flinty platform, handed over the half of a third-class ticket from London, passed through the two open doors, and commenced to climb the long ascent which led into the town. He wore no overcoat, and for protection against the inclement weather he was able only to turn up the collar of his well-worn blue serge coat. The damp of a ceaselessly wet day seemed to have laid its cheerless pall upon the whole exceedingly ugly landscape. The hedges, blackened with smuts from the colliery on the other side of the slope, were dripping also with raindrops. The road, flinty and light grey in colour, was greasy with repellent-looking mud. There were puddles even in the asphalt-covered pathway which he trod. On either side of him stretched the shrunken, unpastoral-looking fields of an industrial neighbourhood. The town village, which stretched up the hillside before him, presented scarcely a single redeeming feature. The small, grey stone houses, hard and unadorned, were interrupted at intervals by rows of brand-new red-brick cottages. In the background were the tall chimneys of several factories. On the left, a colliery shaft raised its smoke-blackened finger to the lowering clouds. After his first glance around at these familiar and unlovely objects, Philip Romilly walked with his head a little thrown back, his eyes lifted as though with intent to the melancholy and watery skies. He was a young man, well above medium height, slim, almost inclined to be angular, yet with a good carriage, notwithstanding a stoop which seemed more the result of an habitual depression than occasioned by any physical weakness. His features were large, his mouth querulous, a little discontented, his eyes filled with the light of a silent and rebellious bitterness which seemed somehow to have found a more or less permanent abode in his face. His clothes, although they were neat, had seen better days. He was ungloved, and he carried under his arm a small parcel, which appeared to contain a book carefully done up in brown paper. As he reached the outskirts of the village, he slackened his pace. Standing a little way back from the road, from which they were separated by an ugly gravelled playground, were the familiar school buildings, with the usual inscription carved in stone above the door. He laid his hand upon the wooden gate and paused. From inside he could catch the drone of children's voices. He glanced at his watch. It was barely 20 minutes past 4. For a moment he hesitated. Then he strolled on, and turning at the gate of an adjoining cottage, the nearest to the schools of a little unlovely row, he tried the latch, found it yield to his touch, and stepped inside. He closed the door behind him and turned with a little weary sigh of content towards a large easy-chair drawn up in front of the fire. For a single moment he seemed about to throw himself into its depths. His long fingers, indeed a little blue with the cold, seemed already on their way towards the genial warmth of the flames. Then he stopped short. He stood perfectly still in an attitude of arrested motion, his eyes, wonderingly at first, and then with a strange, unanalyzable expression, seeming to embark upon a lengthened, a scrupulous, and almost horrified estimate of his surroundings. To the ordinary observer there would have been nothing remarkable in the appearance of the little room, save its entirely unexpected air of luxury and refinement. There was a small Chippendale sideboard against the wall, a round, gate-legged table on which stood a blue china bowl filled with pink roses, a couple of luxurious easy-chairs, some old prints upon the wall. On the sideboard was a basket, as yet unpacked, filled with hothouse fruit, and on a low settee by the side of one of the easy-chairs were a little pile of reviews, several volumes of poetry, and a couple of library books. In the centre of the mantelpiece was a photograph, The photograph of a man a little older, perhaps, than this newly arrived visitor, with rounder face, dressed in country tweeds, a flower in his buttonhole, the picture of a prosperous man, yet with a curious, almost disturbing likeness to the pale, over-nervous, loose-framed youth whose eye had been attracted by its presence and who was gazing at it spellbound. "Douglas," he muttered. "Douglas!" He flung his hat upon the table, and for a moment his hand rested upon his forehead. He was confronted by a mystery which baffled him, a mystery whose sinister possibilities were slowly framing themselves in his mind. While he stood there, he was suddenly conscious of the sound of the opening gate, brisk footsteps up the tiled way, the soft twirl of a woman's skirt. The latch was raised, the door opened and closed. The newcomer stood upon the threshold, gazing at him. "Philip!" she exclaimed. "Why, Philip!" There was a curious change in the girl's tone, from almost glad welcome to a note of abrupt fear in that last pronouncement of his name. She stood looking at him, the victim apparently of so many emotions that there was nothing definite to be drawn either from her tone or expression. She was a young woman of medium height and slim, delicate figure, attractive, with large, discontented mouth, full, clear eyes, and a wealth of dark brown hair. She was very simply dressed, and yet in a manner which scarcely suggested the schoolteacher. To the man who confronted her, his left hand gripping the mantelpiece, his eyes filled with a flaming jealousy, there was something entirely new in the hang of her well-cut skirt, the soft coloring of her low-necked blouse, the greater animation of her piquant face with its somewhat dazzling complexion. His hand flashed out towards her as he asked his question. "What does it mean, Beatrice?" She showed signs of recovering herself. With a little shrug of the shoulders, she turned towards the door which led into an inner room. "Let me get you some tea, Philip," she begged. "You look so cold and wet." "Stay here, please," he insisted. She paused reluctantly. There was a curious lack of anything peremptory in his manner, yet somehow, although she would have given the world to have passed for a few moments into the shelter of the little kitchen beyond, she was impelled to do as he bade her. "Don't be silly, Philip," she said petulantly. "You know you want some tea, and so do I. Sit down, please, and make yourself comfortable. Why didn't you let me know you were coming?" "Perhaps it would have been better," he agreed quietly. "However, since I am here, answer my question." She drew a little breath. After all, although she was lacking in any real strength of character, she was filled with a certain compensatory doggedness. His challenge was there to be faced. There was no way out of it. She would have lied willingly enough, but for the sheer futility of falsehood. She commenced the task of bracing herself for the struggle. "You had better," she said, "frame your question a little more exactly. I will then try to answer it." He was stung by her altered demeanour, embarrassed by an avalanche of words. 100 questions were burning upon his lips. It was by a great effort of self-control that he remained coherent. "The last time I visited you," he began, "was 3 months ago. Your cottage then was furnished as one would expect it to be furnished. You had a deal dresser, a deal table, one rather hard easy-chair, and a very old wicker one. You had, if I remember rightly, a strip of linoleum upon the floor and a single rug. Your flowers were from the hedges, and your fruit from one apple tree in the garden behind. Your clothes— Am I mistaken about your clothes, or are you dressed more expensively?" "I am dressed more expensively," she admitted. "You and I both know the value of these things," he went on with a little sweep of the hand. "We both know the value of them because we were once accustomed to them, because we have both since experienced the passionate craving for them, or the things they represent. Chippendale furniture, a Turkey carpet, roses in January, hothouse fruit, Bartolozzi prints, do not march with an income of £50 a year." "They do not," she assented equably. "All the things which you see here and which you have mentioned are presents." His forefinger shot out with a sudden vigor towards the photograph. "From him?" "From Douglas," she admitted. "From your cousin." He took the photograph into his hand, looked at it for a moment, and dashed it into the grate. The glass of the frame was shivered into 100 pieces. The girl only shrugged her shoulders. She was holding herself in reserve. As for him, his eyes were hot. There was